Moreover, their enthusiasm and dedication encouraged and inspired others to do so as well. They were known for their gracious hospitality, and they were always willing to host charitable events in their beautiful home, where they also held wonderful Pesach Seders. Quietly, without fanfare, they performed many acts of personal generosity to family, friends, as well as complete strangers. On this day of our learning together, may their souls have an aliyah.
Okay, perfect. It's a great honor to dedicate this year in memory of Romy and Blanche Shapiro. As always, we're going to be dedicating the shiur to the well-being of the chayalim and the refuah shlema of all of those who are wounded. And we're going to, and also, of course, the return of the chatufim. We're going to start with the Mizmor Tehillim. We'll please open your Tanakh if you have a Mizmor Tehillim, if you have a Sefer Tehillim. We're going to start with Mizmor Yud Gimel, and then we'll say a tefillah for the war. Mizmor Yud Gimel. Lamenatzach Mizmor LeDavid. Ad ana Adonai tishkacheni netzach. Ad ana tastir et panecha mimeni. Ad ana ashit etzot b'nafshi yagon bilvavi yomam. Ad ana yarum oivi alai. Habita aneni Adonai Elohai. Ha'ira einai pen ishan hamavet. Pen yomar oivi yecholtiv. Sarai yagilu ki emot. Va'ani b'chastecha v'tachti. Yagel libi b'shuatecha. Ashira l'Adonai ki gamal alai. Avinu shebashamayim, tzur Yisrael v'goalo, barechet medinat Yisrael, reshit smichat geulatenu. Hagen alea be'evrat chasdecha, ufros alea sukat shalomecha. Ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'rasha asara v'yotzeh v'taknem be'etzah tova milfanecha. Chazek et yedei meginei eretz kodshenu ushlach beracha v'atzlacha b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. Hadber son'enu tachtehem v'anchilem Eloheinu shua v'ater nitzachon te'atreim v'tatzilem mikol tzara v'tzuka mikol nega u'machala v'tishmor v'tintzar ne'edrei tzva hagana Yisrael v'tashvuim mimitkefet haterror timalei rachamim alehem u'tshivei meira l'chik mishpechotehem bri'im u'shlemim begufam u'v'nafsham v'tishlach meira refuah shlema min hashamayim l'chol haptzuim mikerav kochot habitachon והפצועים ממתקפת הטרור בתוך שאר חולי ישראל, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף. ותעביר ממשלות זדון מן הארץ, ומלוך על כל העולם כולו בכבודך, וינשא על כל הארץ ביקרך. ותיטע אהבה ואחווה, שלום ורעות בינינו, ובין כל ישראל, ונתת שלום בארץ, ושמחת עולם ליושביה, ונאמר אמן. All right. Good morning. It's wonderful to see you all here at Matan. In today's class, we're going to be talking mostly about Moshe and about Moshe's relationship with God and how that really is part of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yesterday, somebody asked me, what is the goal of Yetziat Mitzrayim? Right? So there are a lot of goals of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yetziat Mitzrayim is really the story of the making of a nation. And the making of a nation is about many things, right? It certainly is about, and I'll say those words again, Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? It's about leaving Mitzrayim behind. When I say leaving Mitzrayim behind, I mean leaving the idea of Mitzrayim behind, right? Leaving the morality or the immorality of Mitzrayim behind, but also leaving a certain religious conception of Mitzrayim behind, right? So when we leave Mitzrayim, we are leaving behind the nation that really has functioned thus far with a very having a very significant impact on the world at large, right? They've been world leaders. And from this point forward, we kind of leave Mitzrayim shrouded in darkness. I don't mean we do, right? That's exactly what we do. If you look at Parshat Bo are the three final plagues of Egypt, which are all plagues of darkness. Many of you have probably heard me say this before, right? It's Arbeh, it's locusts, which cover the sun, vatechshach haaretz, and so the land becomes dark. That's the 8th plague. And the 9th plague is a plague of darkness. And the 10th plague occurs in the middle of the night. So as we leave Egypt behind in darkness, right? And the last one out turns out the light, right? That's the idea of leaving Egypt. And then we turn our attention forward, right? And so when Yeshayahu says in Perek Tet Pasuk Aleph, Ha'am ha'holchim b'choshech ra'u or gadol, right? That nation that was walking in darkness has now seen a great light, right? I think that that's the forward-looking movement as we move out of Egypt. We're leaving behind a nation that has been condemned to darkness, and they've been condemned to darkness because they've strewn darkness, they've brought darkness, right? Darkness being a place of immorality, but also a place which is lacking a sense of God's presence, right? Hashem Ori V'ishi, right? God is my light and my salvation. And the idea of creating this new nation, right, who is now meant to take the reins of leadership and move forward in creating a nation that creates light in the world, right? It's both a story of Ben Adam Lechavero, it's a story of creating a world of morality, which is of course the opposite of what we see in Egypt, but it's also a story of creating a relationship with God, right? This is the story that is eventually, I think, really picked up by Yeshayahu and very much developed by Yeshayahu when he describes the return of Am Yisrael from Bavel, right? During the time of Shivat Zion. So Yeshayahu, in his chapters of Nechama, in his chapters of renewal, when he's describing Am Yisrael coming back to the land, he keeps talking about Am Yisrael's light. We are meant to be leor goyim. We are meant to be a light for the nations, right? And Yeshayahu says to Am Yisrael, he says to Yerushalayim, Kumi ori kiva orech uchvod Hashem alayich nigla. Get up, shine your light, because God's light, God's glory is resting upon you, right? Right? The darkness is shrouding the earth. All of the nations are steeped in darkness, right? The confusion, the lack of moral clarity, the lack of sense of the bright light of God's presence. That's what's shrouding the earth. And Am Yisrael is being told, get up and shine that light of clarity upon the world, right? Could be talking today. No, I see all of you looking at me like the sense that the world doesn't change that much, right? And so Am Yisrael is given this mandate already beginning in Egypt. Now, in today's class, I want to take us to the story of the burning bush, and not so much to talk about the later issues of building the nation, but really to give us a sense of that very first encounter between Moshe and God. Okay, one of the interesting things I think that we need to note when it comes to Moshe is that in our initial encounter with Moshe, I'm going to say it a little bit harshly, Moshe is not a man of God. Right? I mean, that's a pretty harsh thing to say, but I mean, we certainly see that without a doubt, Moshe becomes the person who is closest to achieving a very intimate kind of relationship with God. Certainly, in Tanakh, right? How is his relationship with God described? God speaks to Moshe, panim el panim, kasher yidaber ish el re'ehu, right? God speaks to Moshe face to face, like a person speaks to his friend, right? I mean, if it wasn't written, I couldn't say it, right? And so this notion that Moshe eventually becomes the Ish Elohim, the man of God, the one who speaks to God in this very direct and ongoing kind of communication, and that's very much part of who Moshe is. But in our first encounter with Moshe, what we encounter is a man of morality, right? That's Moshe. First of all, that's Moshe as a baby. I mean, he's not a man at all. He's not even he has no agency, but we get these, 10 psukim that describe Moshe, the infant, right? In which all these figures, female figures, right, are kind of, swirling around Moshe, trying to save him, right? In spite of the fact that there's, of course, a terrible decree of genocide, right? Of the killing of all the boy babies, right? That's going on in Egypt, and all the women are trying to save Moshe. So Moshe is saved because of a strong moral sense, right? Because of a strong morality of the women around him. And when he emerges from the palace, presumably as a young man, we don't actually know his age then, he engages in acts of saving, right? Of saving the oppressed from the oppressor, of saving, in each case, right? He's saving people regardless of who they are and what their ethnicity is, right? He saves a Hebrew from an Egyptian, he saves a Hebrew from a Hebrew, he saves Midianite girls from Midianite shepherds, right? He's just out there trying to make the world a better place, okay? Now, when Moshe first meets God, it's only in the next chapter, right? In Perek Gimel. And that is the story of the Sneh HaBo'er Ba'esh, right? And this is, I think it's a really, I mean, not just I think, the Midrashim think it's a really significant story. It's a really significant moment. It's a really significant symbolic experience as well, right? The Midrashim spend a great deal of time. We're going to look at a little bit of this today in our source sheet, but the Midrashim spent a great deal of time trying to understand not just the way in which the story unfolds, but also the symbolism of this burning bush, right? It's a very interesting image. The Midrashim are very interested in it, but maybe I think what's really most interesting about it is the way that it kind of sets in motion the story of Moshe's relationship with God, right? And that story isn't the first story in Moshe's life, right? So that itself, I think, is interesting. And when we look at this, it's a pretty, I think, well-known story. Moshe is out shepherding his father-in-law's sheep in the desert, right? The fact that he's shepherding these sheep in the desert also draws the attention of some of the Parshanim. Why doesn't he go to maybe more fertile pasture, right? There's an interesting machloket. It's actually a wonderful machloket among the Parshanim, where Rashi says, and I think we're all students of Rashi, so we're more likely to be familiar with Rashi's approach. Rashi says, well, of course, he had to go to the desert because he doesn't want to, God forbid, by mistake, pasture his sheep on somebody else's land. Moshe's greatest fear is immoral behavior, right? And so he takes his sheep off into the desert because he is afraid of, by mistake, stealing people's land, right? So this image that Moshe of Moshe that Rashi kind of draws for us is an image of a person of great morality, right? Well, the Sforno says, no, that's not why he went to the desert. I mean, he's not arguing with Rashi. He just says, why did Moshe take his sheep out to the desert? He was trying to get to Chorev. He was going to a place where he could find God, where he could be alone and solitary, right? He paints Moshe as the first Breslover. He goes out into the desert, right? To lihit boded, ulihit palel, right? To be alone and to pray to God. And what's interesting about this machloket, of course, is that the Sforno is saying, no, Moshe's essential being is not his morality, it's his spirituality, right? So, of course, this is not a machloket, right? We know it's both. And the two actually, I think, really come together in these initial stories of Moshe. Moshe is certainly chosen by God because of his great moral sense, because of his great moral character. But of course, at the burning bush, we're also going to experience that Moshe has this great spiritual capacity as well. Okay, so let's see if we can a little bit get a sense of this story, this initial encounter between Moshe and God at the bush. And ultimately, I also want to take it in direction, of course, of not just what that means for Moshe, but what it means for Am Yisrael's encounter with God, right? Moshe is not just an individual, he's a leader. He's arguably the greatest leader that Am Yisrael ever has, right? And he is the one also who leads Am Yisrael to our own experience of encounter with God, right? So there's what I think we are meant to be learning from this encounter is not just what happened with Moshe, but what happened with Am Yisrael and what happens with each of us in our encounter with God. So there's something I think very instructive about these moments in Moshe's life in terms of Moshe's role as role model. When you look at this burning bush, the bush is described as boer ba'esh, right? It is burning with fire. V'hasneh einenu ukal, but it's not consumed. So the Midrashim, I think, really take this in two different directions, okay? And I think we're vaguely familiar with both these directions because they come up over and over in the Parshanim. Maybe some of you are familiar with both of these directions. In the first and maybe even more common reading, the burning bush becomes a symbol of Am Yisrael's suffering in Egypt, right? We have a bush, which is thorny. We have a fiery conflagration, which kind of traps them in this bush. Let's look, for example, look in source number 1. I brought for you a midrash, the Yalkut Shimoni, which asks the question, Ma darko shel sneh? What is the way of this bush? By the way, we have actually no idea what this bush is. We don't know if it's thorny. We don't know if it's small. We don't know if it's big. And there's just being honest, we can't really identify the sneh. But the assumption of this midrash is going to be that this bush, like many desert bushes, right, is a thorny bush. So Ma darko shel sneh, what is the way of this bush? Adam machnis yado letocho. When a person puts his hand into the bush, eino nizok, he is not harmed. Lefisha kotzav kfufim lamata, because this particular bush, the thorns were facing inward. So he puts his hand in and he thinks everything's fine. The impikesh lohotziet yado, but of course, when he tries to take his hand out of the bush, hakotzim tofsim ba, right? The thorns prevent him from doing so. They're grabbing his hand, they're entrapping it, and of course, they're also harming him. So he can't take his hand out. So the Midrash says, this is a symbol of Am Yisrael, their entrapment, and of course, their anguish, their suffering in Egypt. Right? When Am Yisrael first went into Egypt, they weren't Am Yisrael yet. They were, of course, just the family of Yosef or the family of Yaakov. When they go, they're welcomed with open arms. Of course, Yosef has been extremely beneficial to Egypt, right? And so they're welcomed with open arms. Shneimar Eretz Mitzrayim lefanecha hi ukshebikshu latzeit, but when they wanted to leave, lo henichum, they didn't allow them to do so. Shneimar right? And so the image of the burning bush becomes an image of their suffering and entrapment in Egypt. Now, of course, we can't forget the fire. Source number 2, the Shemot Rabbah 2:6. By the way, this Shemot Rabbah 2:6 is a very, very long midrash. And the Midrash just keeps going on and on and on about the different symbolisms. You'll see I also cite it in source number 4, but I could have brought for you many more citations from Shemot Rabbah 2:6. It's very long discourse on the different possible symbolisms of this burning bush, right? Davar acher, davar acher, davar acher keeps bringing up different possible readings. So look in source number 2. Vayar v'nei asnet boer ba'esh. Mikan amru ha'esh shel mala mala lulavim v'sorefet ve'ina ochelet v'hishchora ha'esh v'hishchora ha'esh shamata eina mala lulavim v'hi aduma ve'ochelet ve'ina sorefet. Right, they're describing the different colors. Above it's black, below it's red. Above it doesn't consume, below it does consume. Some of the details here are not necessarily significant. This is the part that I wanted you to see. Why does God show Moshe this image of a bush that is burning? Here the Midrash is very focused on the fire. Because Moshe was thinking in his heart, Ve'omer, and he said to himself, Shema yuah Mitzrim mechalin et Israel. Maybe the Mitzrim are going to consume and destroy Israel, right? What is the fire? Fire is something that consumes. It's frightening, right? No one's putting it out. Therefore, what does God show Moshe? Hara'eo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Eish Bo'eret ve'einenu ukal. Right, that's the significant point. Therefore, God shows Moshe an image of a bush that is burning with fire, but it is not consumed. Amarlo, and he said to Moshe, God said to Moshe, Kishem sha'asneh bo'er ba'esh ve'einenu ukal, kach hamitzrim einan yecholin lechalot et Yisrael. Just as the bush burns, but it is not consumed, so the Egyptians cannot burn Israel, so the pogroms could not burn Israel, so the Holocaust cannot burn Israel, so today Israel cannot be consumed. Right? I looked on Google. I looked at for the words v'hasneh einenu ukal. I found 3 books with that name. It's a great name for a book, right? 2 of those books were about the Holocaust. Right? V'hasneh einenu ukal. The bush cannot be consumed. It's a remarkable thing. Right? I'm not the first to comment on this. This is a remarkable aspect of Am Yisrael's history of terrible persecutions, of remaining a very small minority among the nations, which has always been singled out for hatred and persecutions. V'hasneh einenu ukal. But that bush cannot be destroyed. I would even take this one step further and say that oftentimes, several times in the Tanakh, in Sefer Devarim, in Sefer Yirmiyahu, in a few other Sfarim, Mitzrayim is described as a kor barzel, as a furnace for metal. Right? It's a place where what is a kor barzel? A kor barzel is a place that you put metals inside of it, right? In order so that the metals should be hardened and made stronger and also unified, right? It brings the metals together and it strengthens them, right? So one might even make the argument, and I think it's a good argument to be made, that when Am Yisrael is placed in the fire of persecution, not only does it not consume them, but it strengthens and unifies them. That doesn't mean we want to be in a fire, but it means that is definitely part of the process, right? So all of these approaches to the burning bush really suggest that the image is preparing Moshe for his mission, right? Because Moshe encounters this burning bush, and what does he see? He sees something which is very frightening. He sees something which is very distressing, but he also sees hope. He also sees hope. And this will lead God to say to Moshe in the continuation of the parak, Ra'o ra'iti et ani et oni ami Yisrael asher b'Mitzrayim ve'et za'akatam shamati, right? I see their troubles, ve'et za'akatam shamati, and I hear their cries, mipnei nogzav ki adati et machovav, right? I hear their cries because of their oppressors, and I know their pain. And now, lech ve'eshacha el paro. So the image that he sees here, according to many of these parshanim, is one that really prepares him for his mission. But there's a whole different way to go with this. And I think that that's also magnificent, because I think both are correct, right? The whole different way to go with this is to say, this is not a message about Am Yisrael. What is the sneh habo'er ba'esh? It is a theophany. It is God's revelation, right? Of course, Eish in Tanakh is very often a symbol of God, right? We'll talk about that shortly, right? I mean, we have God appearing in fire, right? Or, some aspect of revelation of God is often described as fire. Fire is a wonderful symbol for God, right? For so many reasons. I mean, it kind of moves upward. It's amorphous, right? It's something which is, we desire to draw close to it, but we also a little bit have proper reverence from if we're smart, right? We don't draw close to it without taking great care, right? There's a lot about fire, I think, that makes it a very apt symbol for God. And so many of the parshanim or many of the midrashim simply say, this is a revelation, right? This is God appearing to Moshe. It has nothing to do with Am Yisrael in Egypt. And the message that God is going to give Moshe starting in Pasuk Zayin is the second movement of the story. The first movement of the story is God introducing himself to Moshe. Moshe has never met God. And many of the Midrashim, and I brought for you one here as an example, in order to convey this point, many of the Midrashim, when they ask the question, what is the burning bush? What is the symbolism of the burning bush? What they're really asking is, why does God choose to appear in a bush? Assuming that God is the fire, right? We don't have to explain the fire because the fire is a symbol for God. So then the only real question that remains is, why in a bush? So look in source number 3, and this is the Mechelta, and this Midrash says as follows. Rabbi Eliezer ben Erech Amar, mipnei ma nigla kadosh baruch hu mishmei marom, v'hu medaber im Moshe mitoch hasneh. Why does God come from the highest of heavens and he comes down to speak to Moshe from this lowly bush? The halo hayalu ledaber merosh harim umigovhei olam umearzei levanon. Right, what he really should have done is appear to Moshe from the tops of mountains and from the cedar trees. Right, he should have gone to the most majestic and magnificent place, and that would be a symbol of God's splendor, of God's glory. It's a good question, right? And we say similar things about Har Sinai. We say, oh, Har Sinai was a low mountain. Since we can't identify Har Sinai, we can't weigh in on that. But what we can weigh in on is Har Habayit, right? Which, no, sorry, not Har Habayit. Yeah, no, Har Habayit is higher than, sorry, take that back. Ir David is lower than, that's what I was picturing. I was picturing all the mountains around Ir David. Okay, so scratch that. But there certainly is this kind of midrash, which is also said about Har Sinai. And look at what the midrash says. It says the same thing about Har Sinai. Ella hishpil atzmo v'diber mitoch hasneh. Right? God humbled himself in order to speak from within the bush. Okay, so we have this. I think it's a wonderful message. Right? What is the message of this midrash? The message of this midrash is that the first revelation of God to Moshe, the one that really I think paves the path for Am Yisrael's upcoming relationship with God, is one that suggests, it doesn't suggest it is about, it's really set into motion by God's humility, which I think is the basis of human relationship with God. Or if you think about it, or we don't think about it too much because to us it's sort of self-evident, right? We grew up, you get up in the morning, you dive into God, right? You say brachot to God, you speak to God, right? That's part of what we do, right? You look at the Tanakh, everybody's speaking to God. But I think we do need to pause for a minute and think of what is so extraordinary about this. The fact that God is willing to engage in any sort of communication with human beings is a tremendous act of humility on God's part. Okay, now it already starts in Bereshit Perek Aleph, right? I think one of the great messages of Bereshit Perek Aleph is that even though human beings are created as one of God's creatures, they're also set off from God's creatures by several things. First of all, the Tselem Elohim, right? They're the only ones that get this Tselem Elohim, this image of God, whatever, however we understand what that is. But also, they're the only creature in Bereshit Perek Aleph that God, after he creates them, he speaks to them. Immediately, he turns to them and speaks to them, which is extraordinary, right? And so I think that here, the idea of the Midrash is don't think that God's revelation is self-evident, right? It's not self-evident. It comes from God's humility, from God's willingness to contract himself, right? We talk about tzimtzum, right? To contract himself in order to have a relationship with human beings. And this is part of the story here. Okay, so there are basically two ways to go with understanding the burning bush. I will just say that Rashi, right, I think here is, shows his inimitable style in choosing a midrash here, right? Because again, as I said, there are really endless midrashim to choose. It's always interesting to see which midrash Rashi chooses. Now, Rashi is going to choose a midrash that he's going to abbreviate. Okay, but I want you to see the midrash in full, and then we'll look at Rashi. Look at source number 4. The Midrash said this. I love this Midrash. This is extraordinary Midrash. Amar Rabbi Yanan. Ma teomim halalu im chashash echad berosho chavero margish. Kach amar hakadosh baruch hu v'yachol imo anochi b'tzara. So the Midrash starts out by saying, it's a mashal, right? It's a parable to twins. Okay, twins have a very unique connection, right? Maybe some of you are twins, maybe some of you have twin children or grandchildren, right? Twins have a unique connection, right? They grew up, they were conceived in the same womb, and they grew up in this, I think, very intimate kind of relationship. So the Midrash says, when one twin, his head is hurting, the other one feels it, right? The other one feels it. There's this kind of, empathy between twins. So what is this a mashal for, says the Midrash? It's a mashal for God and Am Yisrael. Right? We're twins. And so when Am Yisrael is suffering in Egypt, God says, Imo anochi b'tzara. I'm also suffering. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. And God says to Moshe, I ata margisha ani sharoi b'tzar, kashem sheYisrael shorim b'tzar? Do you not see that I am deep in suffering, in anguish, just as Am Yisrael is suffering in anguish? Havei yodea mimakom shani medaber imach mitoch hakutzim kiviyachol ani shutaf b'tzaaran. You should know from the place from which I am speaking, in the middle of this thorny bush, that I am suffering just as they are suffering. It's such a wonderful midrash on so many levels. But again, the midrash is kind of combining these two ideas. What is the symbol of the burning bush? Well, yeah, it's about Am Yisrael's suffering, but it's also about God's revelation. How does God reveal himself to Moshe as a suffering God, right? And why is God suffering? God is suffering because Am Yisrael are suffering. So the fire is God. The thorny bush is a symbol of Am Yisrael's suffering. And God deliberately appears within this thorny bush to show his own anguish. It's such a wonderful midrash, with all of its sort of anthropomorphic qualities. This idea that God is a twin of Am Yisrael and experiences this kind of empathy is really extraordinary. Rashi says something very, very succinct. Look at Rashi, mitoch hasneh, velo ilan acher, mishum imo anochi b'tzara. Says, why doesn't God appear in a different tree? Because he wanted to show, I am with Am Yisrael in suffering, right? So this is just a great example of the kinds of midrashim that Rashi brings and how he often abbreviates ideas in order to understand the idea properly. We have to go back to the midrash and see the midrash fully. In any case, though, I think that this is also, I think, a very adequate midrash for explaining the nature of the way in which God intends to persuade Moshe to go on his mission, right? It was, you're going on this mission because you need to empathize with Am Yisrael. If you don't empathize with Am Yisrael, so then you are you're problematic from a moral perspective, right? This kind of empathy that God has, he's also trying to persuade Moshe to have. Okay, so these are the two ways that we look at the burning bush. For our purposes, I want to examine without, I think that both ways, of course, are correct, and I especially love the combination of these two ways in that final midrash that we saw. But for our purposes, I want to look at the theology of this story. I want to see what this story teaches us. And I think it teaches us a great deal about the nature of this first encounter between God and Moshe. Okay, so let's look in source number 5. I just brought for you the psukim, but I usually don't bring psukim on source sheets. I did it today because I figured there would be people here also who may not bring Tanakh, although I know it's on everybody's phone today, but also because I wanted to show you actually the structure of Pasuk Bet, because I think it's really it's really very interesting. Look at this. This is one pasuk. It has 3 sentences. Vayera malach Hashem elav belabat esh mitoch asneh. Right, Moshe is innocently going about his business, shepherding his sheep, and this angel of God appears to him in this conflagration inside the bush. Vayar, and he sees v'hinei hasineh boer ba'esh. Right, every time the word sneh appears, the bush, it appears with the definite article. Hasneh, right, is the bush, right? And it appears over and over and over. This story really focuses our attention on the bush. He looks and the bush is burning with fire. V'hasineh einenu ukal. And that bush is not consumed. So what I first wanted you to see about the bush, about the description of the bush, is that the literary structure actually shows us Moshe approaching the sneh, right? Look at how the first sentence, the word hasneh, is at the end of the sentence. He's far, right? In the second sentence, the word hasneh is in the middle of the sentence. In the third sentence, it's the first word. It's just like, I think, a wonderful indication of how the Tanakh works with, kind of literary methodologies to convey something, right? So we have the sense of Moshe slowly or maybe rapidly, right, approaching the sneh, and he gets to this sneh and he's standing right next to the sneh, right? We have this very visual scene that is created here, but here's the significant point. Look at the next pasuk. Vayomer Moshe. Now Moshe speaks. Asura na ve'er'eh et hamar'eh hagadol hazeh madua lo yiv'ar hasneh. Suddenly the sneh is all the way at the end, right? So you have this sense, even just from paying attention to the location of the word sneh, that Moshe is close and Moshe is far, right? Again, this might even be a mental exercise, right? Because Moshe is wondering, he's curious, but he's not understanding it, right? So he's kind of pulling forward and pulling backward when he's talking about the sneh, when he's thinking about the sneh. And this, of course, leads us to God's initial contact with Moshe, right? Until now, it's just been Moshe himself. Of course, many Parshanim here also talk about Moshe's curiosity, right? The fact that he goes to see this sneh, that's maybe the first movement in spiritual development, right? The interest, the curiosity, the willingness to go out of one's way in order to try to understand the world better, especially things about the world that we don't understand, right? Of which there are a great deal of things. Okay, so look in Pasuk Daled, Vayar Hashem kisar lir'ot. Okay, so there's that moment, right? God sees that he turned aside to see. By the way, there's I didn't bring it for you, but there's a wonderful midrash here that based on these words, Vayar Hashem kisar lir'ot, you know, when you're reading this, that Vayar Hashem kisar lir'ot is referring to Moshe deviating from his path and going to the sneh. Why? Because in the previous pasuk, or two psukim ago, Moshe uses the same words. Asura na ve'ar'eh. I will turn aside. He's going off the path and I will see. And so God sees kisar lir'ot. But what's wonderful is that there's a midrash that says something entirely different about explaining these words. Vayar Hashem kisar lir'ot, says the midrash, is referring back to Moshe's actions when he comes out of the palace in Perek Bet. Because when he comes out of the palace in Perek Bet, Pasuk Yud Aleph, we're told, Vayamim ahim vayigdal Moshe vayetze alachav vayar b'sivlotam. He sees the sufferings of Am Yisrael. So the Midrash says, why does God choose Moshe? Because in a way, he chose Moshe before Moshe turns aside to see, simply by appearing there in a burning bush. So the Midrash says, why did God appear to Moshe? Because God saw that Moshe was a man who saw others. God saw that Moshe was a man of great morality. Here comes that machloket again, right? It's that same debate. Is Moshe chosen because he's a man of great spiritual capacity, because he turns aside to try to understand the world, to see the burning bush? Or is Moshe chosen because he's a man of great morality, right? And the answer, of course, is both, always both, right? Always both. This is, I think, the unique weave of Moshe's really exemplary personality, right? That's who Moshe is throughout the story. Okay, so God sees that Moshe turned aside. God calls to him from within the bush. Just pay attention to those words. I bolded them on purpose. We're going to come back to them later. God calls to Moshe from within the bush. Vayomer, Moshe, Moshe. I did it that way on purpose. Moshe, Moshe. Vayomer hineni. Why did I say Moshe, Moshe like that? There are 4 people in Tanakh who God calls to them and doubles their name, right? Who else? Good. Avram. Who else? Shmuel. Everybody for some reason skips this one. No, you skipped it, meaning it's previously, not Eliyahu. He does call it Eliyahu. There's a very, it's a good answer because there's a very similar Eliyahu-like scenario at the top of Har Chorev in Malachim Aleph Perek Yuteh. But God doesn't call to him there Eliyahu. He says to him, Malachaf Eliyahu, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be back in Shomron helping the people. There's a rebuke there in God's call to Eliyahu. Now, who's the fourth person who has a double name? Nope, not Yitzchak. Yaakov. Okay, good. We were getting there, right? So it's Avram, Yaakov, Moshe, Shmuel. Look, there's a lot to say about that. When you have this call, there's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of love, right? There's a lot of parshanut about this. But I want you to note one thing, and that is that there's a difference between the call to Moshe and the call to the other three. And that's why I said Moshe. Right? Because in all three other cases, there is a tam, one of the tamei mikra between the two words, which is a psik, right? It's a little line that creates a pause. So when you're reading it as a Baal Koreh, you say Avraham, Yaakov, Shmuel. Well, you wouldn't read that as a Baal Koreh, but okay, right? So, but when we get to Moshe, there's no line. Moshe, right? Okay, so the Parshanim actually go in two different directions with this. One is they say it's the urgency of the matter. There's just no time. I don't have time for a pause here. The people are in Egypt, right? They're suffering. They're in this thorny bush in this terrible fiery furnace, right? You got to get down there. So that's one approach as to why this psik is missing. The other approach is that Moshe is different than all the others because he is in a constant state of communication with God. It's just an overflow. There's never a stop. There's never a pause. So those are the two ways that the Parshanim go with it. What I want you to see here is this great excitement, right? This Moshe, right? And there's always great excitement when there's the doubling of the name, right? The doubling of the name means I'm telling you something really important. I really want to communicate this to you and only to you, Moshe. And Moshe's response is equally wonderful, like everybody who gets this doubled name, right? This call from God, Hineni, I'm here. I'm ready to do whatever you want, which is, of course, extremely important to know here because Moshe is going to go on, and as soon as God tells him what he wants him to do, Moshe is going to refuse 5 times. Okay, we're not going to get there, but that's the continuation of the story of the burning bush. Moshe says, well, I don't know. And who's Am Yisrael? They're not going to believe me. And I'm kvad peh and kvad lashon. I mean, he has every reason in the world not to go. But the initial encounter is Hineni, anything you want, I'm here to do, which is wonderful because it matches the Moshe, which is why the next pasuk is so extraordinary. Look at the first instruction that God gives Moshe. Vayomer al tikrav. Hello. Stop. Don't come close. But that's not what I expected. Especially with this Moshe. So God is like drawing him in, and Moshe is drawing near, right? And God says, stop. Al tikrav. Don't come close. Right? Which again, when you see it within context, it's jarring. I think it's meant to be jarring. And then he tells Moshe, right? Take off your shoes. This is a very holy place, right? And then God introduces himself to Moshe, right? Until this point, right? Moshe is still, somewhat confused. He hears the call. He says, I'm here to do, I'm here, Hineni, right? And yet, of course, it's only in Pasuk Vav that he's actually told what's going on here. Vayomer, and God says it, God introduces himself, Anochi Elohei Avicha, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. And what is Moshe's response? And this also, I think, is a response which is, entirely expected or entirely unexpected, depending on your perspective, right? What does Moshe do? What would you do, right? Vayaster Moshe panav ki yarei mehabit el ha'elohim. Moshe hides his face. So, and of course the words vayaster panav, what does it remind us of? Hester panim, right? When God hides his face from us in a punitive way, right? This initial moment, the minute that Moshe hears that he's standing before God, what does he do? He hides his face. Now, on one level, I think you're all probably thinking, yeah, Moshe did what is intuitively correct, right? Who else hides their face when they realize that they're standing before God? I'll give you a hint. Someone said it before. Eliyahu, right? At the top of Har Choreh. Once, God goes by in the Ruach and the Eish and the Rash, lo beruach Hashem, lo b'Eish Hashem, lo b'Rash Hashem, right? God's not in any of those, in any of those natural destructive events, right? But then there's the cold Mama Daka, right? Think Yom Kippur, right? The cold Mama Daka, that small, still voice. And then he wraps his aderet around his face, right? He does a Moshe-like thing, but I think we're familiar enough with this act that it seems intuitively correct, which is why I want to bring for you this wonderful midrash. This midrash in source number 6. Look at the midrash in source number 6. I think probably every time I introduce a midrash, I call it wonderful. But that's because I choose these wonderful, all the midrashim are amazing, but I really try to bring the ones that I think really speak to the human condition, right? This one certainly, I think, is just, it's such an important midrash. And this midrash, by the way, also appears in the Gemara in Brachot. I brought it in the midrash. I think it's a little bit clearer in the midrash, telling Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha and Rabbi Yoshaya. Echad mehen omer, lo yafe asa Moshe kshe histir panav. Which is an amazing conclusion. It says Moshe didn't do the right thing when he hid his face. And then the Midrash goes on and explains, she'ilulei lo histir panav, gila lo hakadosh baruch hu, mala mala, umala mata, umasha haya, umasha atid liyot. Had Moshe not hidden his face at this moment, let's just paraphrase and say he would have achieved a great deal in his direct relationship with God. And how do I know he didn't achieve what he could have achieved? Says the Midrash, ubasof, in the end, bikesh lirot. He did want to see all these things. And he said to God, Hareinina et kvodecha, right? And Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, says the Midrash, God said to Moshe, Ani bati larot lecha. I wanted to show you. V'histar panecha, but you hid your face. You took a step back. Shav ani omer lecha, ki lo yirani adam v'chai. Now I'm going to tell you, nobody can see me. Kshebikashti, lo bikashta. When I wanted to show you, you didn't want it. Now you want it. I don't want to give it to you anymore. Wow, that's harsh, right? That's really harsh. Rabbi Yoshua of Sachnin doesn't like that so much, but we'll skip ahead to Rabbi Yoshaya. Look down 3 lines from now. Everybody sort of responds to this, I think, a little bit. I mean, I see your faces, right? Like, really? I mean, Moshe seemed to do the right thing. It seems like an act of proper reverence. And, okay, so look at Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Yoshaya Rabba Amar Yafeh Asa Sheistir Panav. Right? Moshe did the right thing when he hid his face. Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ani bati larot lecha panim, v'chilakti li kavod, v'chalakta li kavod, v'histarta panecha, chayecha shata atid liot etzli, v'har 40 yom, v'arba'im laila, lo lechol, v'lo lishtot, v'ata atid lehenot miziv hashchina. Okay, so he says, when I came to you, you showed me proper respect, and therefore I'm going to allow you to come up to Har Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and you are going to come down with that glowing face. Okay, so you could see it as the cup half full, you could see it as the cup half empty, which is, I think, really basically the argument here. But the real argument here, of course, is the question of Moshe's act, right? The whole story here of Moshe's initial encounter with God is a story of drawing forward and a story of recoiling backward, right? That's the story, right? He's coming to the sneh. He's not sure. Is he scared of the sneh? Is he able to come close to the sneh? He's drawing forward to God. God stops him. God says, okay, I'm God. Moshe stops, he stops, he covers his face. There's this constant movement backward and forward. And so the machloket is it revolves around whether or not Moshe did the right thing at the right moment. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha says no. Moshe could have achieved a great deal more. He could have surged forward in his relationship with God had he not put the brakes on it. And Rabbi Oshaya says, absolutely not. This was the right measure of reverence and respect and distance that is required in this initial encounter. So what's the right answer? So you're all going to say both, because that is usually the right answer. But that obviously can't. It's actually not both. Right? I don't think that's the right answer. What's the right answer? Well, let's take a vote. Who thinks Yafeh asa Moshe? Okay, who thinks Lo Yafeh asa Moshe? It's always like this, right? There's 2 or 3 courageous people who are willing to say, but in general, I mean, I don't think it's just courage. I think you probably really believe it, but I think in general we're inclined to see Moshe as doing the right thing, which is why I think Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha is so extraordinary here. But what is the right answer? I want to say that the right answer is we don't know. That's the right answer. Not only do we not know, Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha doesn't know, Rabbi Hoshaya doesn't know, Rabbi Yoshua Disachmin doesn't know, and Moshe doesn't know. That's the right answer. It's the great mystery of human beings who are in this ongoing balance in our relationship with God. Yeah.
But I think this is his first encounter with these. You mentioned it. First of all, you said that he was going out for spirituality, to go to the fields, but if you didn't know he was driving from the connection, it wasn't going out for spirituality to the fields. The other question is, he didn't know this. This is new. It's like everything else in life. You have a child, you go into marriage. Anything you do is new, and you watch him grow.
Yeah.
I think the beauty of the story is that we're watching Moshe grow and change and move forward, and I think that's such an important lesson to everybody.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a good argument for Rabbi Hoshaya, but I'm not going to get into the argument right now. There's the argument itself. I think is an argument that we could make, and I think a lot of people would say, Moshe at the beginning of his journey. I will answer your question with regard to if we say that Moshe is out in the desert, searching for a spiritual encounter. Well, I mean, what leads him to that? He comes from Egypt. He grew up in the palace, and if in fact, according to this Sforno, he's really looking for spirituality. Where is that coming from? I think there's a wonderful answer to that question. We all have spirituality inside of us. I think that is an essential part of human beings. I think it's what sets us apart from other creatures. It's what sets us apart from animals. I think it's the Tselem Elohim, right? There's something, I think, very deep in the human need for spirituality. I think we see today, for example, in a Western world that oftentimes, certainly for at the beginning of the Enlightenment, very much shunned spirituality, is now looking for all sorts of alternatives, right, to substitute, because we're all looking for meaning, and human beings, I think, are programmed to search for something that is above them, right, something that is meaningful beyond the world of tangible, concrete physicality. So in my mind, that's a natural movement. I think that's the way the Midrashim describe Avram, right? And again, we don't see that with Avram, but I think that is certainly part of this story. I'm not gonna get into the debate though, right? The debate is one that I think you should take home and have at your Shabbos table, right? It's a really interesting debate, but I'm much more interested in the unresolvability of the debate, right? Because essentially, I think this experience of encountering God and encountering spirituality is a constant balance between a sense of closeness and intimacy and privilege, and a sense of distance and reverence and of respect and even fear, right? And again, I mean, I think it should color every aspect of every day, not just in our tefillah. In our tefillah, we do it also, right? You take those 3 steps backward, we take 3 steps forward, we bend low, we stand tall, right? Which one are we? And how are we talking to God? Is God Avinu? Is he our father? Or is he Malkeinu? is he our king, right? And you know, on Rosh Hashanah, you know, the tefillah is filled with that. Im kivanim, rachamenu kirachim, av avanim. Maybe we're your sons, in which case you should have compassion, like a parent has compassion on children, right? Maybe we're your subjects, in which case we turn to you with a plea, right? Im ka'avadim, einenu l'chat fluyot, ad shetechonenu, right? We're just dependent on you. So what's the right answer? Of course, the right answer is a constant balance. Even in our tefillah about, you know, things that we are, I think everybody here, I'm sure, is davening with all their heart today, right? And we say to ourselves, why isn't God answering? And then we say, well, we don't have the right to demand an answer from God. And then we say, yes, of course we have the right to demand an answer from God. God is Avinu. And then we say, well, we don't have a right to demand an answer from God. God is Malkeinu. Right? We go through that conversation in our head. I assume. I mean, that's part of the story. It's part of the story of human beings who are living in a world in which we can only presume to create and cultivate some kind of communication with them. Right? I think that's what we're seeing here in the Moshe story. I think we see it. Oh no. Wow, that happened much quicker than I did. All right, so then let me say something else, because we have a couple more minutes. Let me say something else, which is that I said that I'm going to take this story to beyond Moshe, and we have a little bit, right? But I want to say two more things about this story. Number one is that the continuation of this story is Am Yisrael and Har Sinai, right? Of course, it happens in the same exact place. Where is Moshe? Moshe is at the top of Har Choreb. Oh, we lost 10 minutes at the beginning of the class. That's why. Okay. So then I give myself a few moments. Okay. So where is Moshe? Moshe is on Har Choreb, right? And in fact, actually, the Ibn Ezra says, I brought for you this Ibn Ezra because this Ibn Ezra is just, it's like once you see it, you can't see it any other way. Some of you may even have heard me cite this because it's an Ibn Ezra that comes up in my mind often in source number 8. He says, well, you know, Har Choreb is called Har Choreb until Moshe encountered the Sneh HaBo'er Ba'esh. And then they renamed the mountain. What did they rename it? Har Sinai. Right? The Sneh is an important symbol of how we encounter God. Right? And so, you know, there are lots of midrashim that talk about how Moshe could go to the top of a mountain, where at the top of the mountain there is a fire which is burning. Eish ochelet birosh hahar. Now for Am Yisrael, this is a terrible idea, because what do they see? They see Moshe, their great leader, going to the top of a mountain, disappearing into an eish ochelet, right, into a consuming fire, and then he doesn't come down, which is of course what leads to the Egel Hazav, right? The golden calf, right? He doesn't come down. And so they say, you know, Moshe Aish, lo yadanu mehayalo, right? I mean, he seems to have been burned by the fire. But the real question that the Midrashim ask is, how could Moshe go into a burning, consuming fire? Because he knows, Hasneh bo'er ba'esh ve'einenu ukal. That's the fire of God. It's a symbol. How can we have a relationship with God? What do we learn? We learn that God's burning fire, if we take the proper precautions. I mean, this past week, of course, we read about Nadav and Avihu, right? We know that the fire is something which, you know, the fire of God, you could call it a lot of things, right? The passion for religion. It is a dangerous force to unleash in the world, right? And we have to encounter this force in a way that doesn't consume us and doesn't cause us to consume others, right? These are just really, I think, fundamental messages that are embedded in this story. But I'll say two more things before I conclude. One thing is that it's not just Moshe's story at the mountain. Of course, he goes up, and the language, by the way, of the mountain is so reminiscent of the Sneh bo'er ba'esh. You know, there are only two things in Tanakh that it says about them, and ex bo'er ba'esh. The hasneh bo'er ba'esh. The hahar bo'er ba'esh. Har Sinai is bo'er ba'esh. It is burning with fire. Now, Am Yisrael, how do they react to the revelation of God on Har Sinai? So if you look in source 14, I brought for you two contradictory psukim, which are of course not contradictory, right? They're the balance that we are holding. Look in Devarim 4:11. Vatikrivun, vatamdun dachar, dahar bo'er ba'esh. They came close, right? They're enthusiastically approaching the mountain, right? Remember, God says to Moshe, limit them. They shouldn't touch the mountain, right? It's dangerous to come too close to God. Al tikrav halom, right? Don't come too close. And if you look in the second source I brought for you in Shemot Parakaf, we're told the amro imetakolot lapidin kol shavar v'tara Hashem vayaram vayanu vayamdu merachok. So we have the karo, and we have the rachok, and this story, it's our story, right? It's everybody's story. It's the story of our relationship with God. It's the story of the way we daven every day. It's the story of the way we think about God. It's the story of religion in the world, right? As I said before, and the story itself, I think, really continues in the Mishkan, which is, of course, the third and final movement of Sefer Shemot, right? We go from Egypt, from the burning bush, to Har Sinai, to the Mishkan, to the building of the Mishkan. And that's exactly what the story of the Mishkan is, as we saw last week with Nadav and Avihu, right? The Mishkan is a place that we come close to it. We bring korbanot, right? But at the same time, we recognize that there are limitations, right? Certain people can go to certain places in certain ways at certain times, right? Sefer Shemot actually ends with a crisis. Sefer Shemot ends with the building of the Mishkan, and we're told God's presence comes down on the Mishkan. There's an Anan and there's an Aish and there's all the symbols of God's presence. And then how does the story end? The lo yachol Moshe lavo, right? He can't come in. Why can't he come in? Because the Aish of God is there. What's the difference between that and the Har, right? Well, we have in all three cases, at the burning bush, on the mountain, and in the Mishkan, we have the same pasuk. Vayikra elav Hashem mitoch hasneh. Vayikra Elokim el Moshe mitoch, or mehahar, right? And then, what is the beginning of Sefer Vayikra? Right? Sefer Shemot ends with Moshe unable to come into the Mishkan. How does Sefer Vayikra open? Calling Moshe to come in and giving Moshe the tools and the formula for coming into the Mishkan. What are the tools and the formula? Korbanot, right? Kedusha, maintaining a heightened sense of your own Tselem Elokim, right? That people mistakenly think that Sefer Vayikra is a sefer about korbanot. That is, it's just not true, right? The first 7 chapters are about korbanot. Sefer Vayikra is the sefer of Kedusha. It's the sefer that teaches us how to encounter God. And with this point, there are 3 areas in which we encounter God. We encounter God in a spatial setting, right? Place, Kedushat HaMakom. We encounter God in a temporal setting, in time, Kedushat HaZman. And the third area of Kedusha is Kedushat HaAdam. Now, when Am Yisrael comes into the Mishkan, right, they are meeting God. They're actually meeting God panim al panim, right? They're facing the Aron, and the Aron is facing them. There's this almost panim al panim encounter. But I want to conclude with my final thought, and that is that there's a midrash, there's a Gemara, it's a Gemara in Bava Batra, and the Gemara tells us that we have 2 contradictory psukim that describe for us the kruvim, right? The kruvim, the cherubs in the Kodesh Kodashim, right? So one pasuk tells us that the kruvim, their faces were el habayit, which means they were looking straight ahead. Another pasuk tells us the kruvim were looking at each other. Okay, so the midrash, the Gemara asked the question, what would be that contradiction? They said, oh, kasha, this isn't a hard contradiction. When they are behaving properly, they're looking at each other. When they're misbehaving, when they're engaged in sinning, they're looking away from each other. And here's the point that I think is significant. At the end of the day, even though we are coming to the Mikdash to have a face-to-face encounter with God, what we're looking for in this face-to-face encounter with God and what enables us to achieve a face-to-face encounter with God is a face-to-face encounter with people, right? The ability to find the Tselem Elohim inside of us rests on our ability to find the Tselem Elohim in the other. And therefore, when we come into the Mikdash, what we're looking to see is that people are looking at each other properly. When you look at Sefer Vayikra divides into 3 parts. The first part is Kedusha Makom, where we talk about Kedusha and Mikdash, right, in the Mishkan. The third part is Kedusha Hazman. Think of Parshat Emor, right? Kedusha of Shabbat, of holidays. The central part, remember, Vayikra is the central book of the Torah. All of the Torah revolves around Sefer Vayikra. The center of the Torah is Kedushat HaAdam. What envelops Kedushat HaAdam are the arayot, maintaining sexual purity. You have to have a pure body in order to find God inside of yourself. But the center is Perek Yud, which begins Kedoshim Tihiyu. Find God within yourself. And the center of Perek Yud, which is the center of the center of the center of the center of the center, right? I think I got that right. Are the words V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That's where we find Kedusha, which I think is a really important message, and one that I think that we are finding today, perhaps in a way that we didn't have a year ago. So I will end with that note. We should have the Surah to vote. We should have that.
Yeah, why does it give human beings the freedom and the right to that's why. Why does it give human beings the freedom and the right to create that world? That's about God not controlling. It's not human.